You have pedal plane questions, and I have a guy named Rob. It's time for FPQ. Welcome to FPQ. I'm Dan Workman. We're very excited to share this first and what we hope will become a series of videos with you today, dedicated to one goal: to make the process of building a pedal plane just a little bit easier. In each video that we create, we hope to share tips and tricks that will help you face many of the common challenges that we all face as pedal plane builders. We'll also be sharing some step-by-step how-to videos, as you'll see in the coming weeks. But today, we're going to get right to it and answer one of our most frequent pedal plane questions, especially from our first-time builders. And the question is, what is the best kind of plywood to use when you build a pedal plane? Seems like a pretty straightforward question. Let's go down to the basement and into Rob's shop as he gives us some pointers on choosing the right kind of plywood to use for your pedal plane.
Hello, welcome to the basement. Today we're going to talk about how to choose that perfect sheet of plywood for your pedal plane project. We're going to break it down to a couple of areas, the first being size and the second being the quality of the wood. And at the end we'll talk about an alternative for those of you who don't want to spend the time and the effort to find that good sheet of plywood for your project. First topic we're going to talk about is size, and you have two choices, 3/8 or 11/32 for the thickness of the plywood. It doesn't matter which one you choose, as the directions will tell you. There's enough slop built into the directions in the construction of the project that either one is fine. It's difficult to find a true 3/8 inch sheet of plywood. It's usually sold in 11/32, but that 1/32 of an inch is really not going to have a significant impact on your build, with a few exceptions. This is a fuselage side that I created as a prototype for a build a few years ago, and we'll look at a couple of the cuts that need to be made in just about any pedal plane project in the fuselage. The first one here is a slot for the horizontal stabilizer, and the second one over here is a dado cut for the instrument panel. Now, I've used a router to create both of these, and that's when that actual dimension becomes important. Because if you use an 11/32 inch router, but you have a true 3/8 sheet of plywood, obviously it's not going to fit in there. It's going to require a lot of extra sanding and even some shaving to get that to fit in there very well. So know what that actual dimension is. If you're going to use a router, make sure that you have the proper 3/8 or 11/32 router bit to make these cuts. If you're doing, say, this cut on a jigsaw, or this one on a table saw as a dado cut, then you can simply adjust the cuts for whatever size wood you're actually using, and everything will come out just fine. The second size element to think about is a 4x8 sheet of plywood or a 5x5 sheet of plywood. The Lowe's, Home Depot, Menards, the big box lumber stores are typically going to sell the plywood in a 4x8 sheet, and one sheet is almost always enough for just about any pedal plane build, even with a few mess ups that are bound to occur in there. If you do wind up at a higher end lumber store to find what I like to use is a good Baltic birch, it's often sold in a 5x5 foot sheet. That, depending on the model of airplane that you're building, might be a little bit tight on materials. So I would recommend, especially for a first-time builder, to maybe pick up a second sheet, and just in case that 5x5 isn't quite enough. The second thing that we'll talk about is the quality of the wood and what to look for when you're picking out that sheet of plywood. Don't just take the top sheet off the stack and throw it in your truck and drive home with it. You may find some disappointments hidden in there that you haven't looked at. The first one is the quality of the wood. Is it an A, B grade plywood? A is going to be free of knots and footballs that we'll talk about in a second here, and sanded on one side. The B side, this is more of an AC, so we'll see a B side here in a minute, but this is why you don't want to go as low as a C grade plywood. It's going to have some pretty large, nasty looking knots, and those are going to show up in your final product, which you definitely want to avoid. So a B grade plywood is obviously a little bit in between, and I'm looking at an AB grade here. The A side again has few if any imperfections on it. The B side has some imperfections, but they've been fixed by what's called a football. They just simply cut out a knot or an imperfection in the wood, replace it with a football shaped patch there. That looks better obviously than the knot that we just saw, but it is still likely to show up on your final product. So we'd like to avoid them if possible, but you're never going to find an AA grade plywood where it's perfect on both sides. So you can usually plan to cut your parts out so that these footballs, the imperfections, are someplace that it's not going to show, like the bottom of the wing or the inside of the fuselage, again, where it's not likely to be visible in your final product. Take a look at the edges of the plywood all around on all 4 edges and see if you notice any voids between the layers of ply. If you see some on the edge, then there's likely more inside. And even if you don't see them on the edge, there's still a possibility of having some inner voids in that plywood. So that's where it really helps to look for what's called like a marine or an aviation grade plywood, where it has few, if any, of those inner voids that you're going to have to deal with later. The problem is when you cut out your parts, sometimes you find those hidden voids in there, and now those voids have to be patched before you finish your project to keep them from being visible and kind of ruining the look of your project. It's a little bit of extra work to do all that, so it's better to find a good grade of plywood to begin with where you don't have to worry about that. Now, if that sounds like a lot of work, which it certainly can be, to find that perfect sheet of plywood, lay out all the parts and cut them out, Aviation Products does offer a wood kit for most, if not all, of their pedal plane kits. It's an extra expense, obviously, but it is a big time saver, and they do use a very, very high grade of plywood. I was doing some projects a few years ago and could not find a good grade of plywood locally, and so I contacted Gary at Aviation Products, got him to agree to sell me some of his plywood since it could only be bought in bulk, and I needed 3 sheets, not 100. And I drove 1,000 miles round trip to get some plywood from Gary, and that's the same stuff that he uses in his kits. It was worth it. So finding that perfect sheet of plywood is the first step in turning out a really nice pedal plane project.
I want to thank Rob Peterson for taking time out of his schedule and helping produce this very first FPQ video. Rob's a great guy, always willing to help, and if any of you have ever asked a question on the pedal plane group before, I'm sure you've noticed that Rob's one of the first to share his knowledge to help our fellow builders out, and we could not have put this video together without him. And for you builders out there, especially you first-timers getting ready to build your pedal plane, hopefully you'll be able to take what Rob said today and put it to good use and get your pedal plane started with a good foundation. Now, we've already shot video number 2 here on FPQ, and we're editing it together right now as we speak, and we are very excited to tell you that we're going to show you start to finish the process for steaming and forming the fuselage of your pedal plane. In the meantime, we need you to like and share this video, and we need you to leave your suggestions for future videos in the comment section. We'll see you next time. On behalf of Rob Peterson, I'm Dan Workman. Have a great build.